Okay, let's move along with our second section of notes for the brain. Your notes should look like this. You're going to have some information about the different parts of the brain that we're going to be talking about, but then also on the back is a diagram that you're going to have to fill in on your own. And then it also goes to this sheet as well with the brain in the middle, and then you're identifying the different hemispheres. So the next part that we're going to be looking at are the higher functioning areas of the brain. We call this your cerebral cortex. So on the top of this sheet, right on there, the cerebral cortex, because those are the first things we're going to talk about. And this is the part of the brain that sets us apart as humans from all other species, because this allows us to do that higher order thinking. So the first thing that we need to know is, what exactly is the cerebral cortex? Well, it is that like gut looking part, right? The folds that come together and account for about 80% of our brain's total mass. Like I said, it's responsible for the most sophisticated information processing. So when we're thinking about other people's emotions, when we're trying to make out math problems, or we're trying to comprehend a book that we are reading, those are all happening in our cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is broken down into lobes, okay, so different parts of the brain, and we're going to go over each one specifically, so don't worry about labeling right now unless you want to pause and do that labeling, but we're looking at this top part of the brain up here, all of these folds that kind of overlay the structures that we talked about in the last video. So the first one we're going to talk about is the frontal lobe. It's right in the front behind your forehead, as well as a little bit up. It's the largest of the lobes. Remember, we have two hemispheres. So we have a hemisphere on the left and a hemisphere on the right. So our frontal lobe, we have two frontal lobes, one in the left hemisphere, one in the right. We also call our frontal lobe the prefrontal cortex. I'll often refer to it as that because our prefrontal cortex is the last to develop, meaning that yours is not fully developed yet. So all of these functions that we're talking about here, yeah, you're not so great at them yet, but that's okay. It builds and it develops as far as we know up until you're about 25, 26 years old. So the frontal lobe is going to control things like judgment. So can I drive this car after I have drank alcohol? Planning. So I would like to go to college, therefore I should take the ACT. It's also responsible for producing our speech sounds, controlling our emotions, which you probably know right now that you're not great at. Remember, you like blow up at your parents for the smallest things. That's because your prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet. It determines our personality. A lot of our personality is housed in that very front section of our brain. Again, your personality is still developing. Your temperament, so how calm or how like agitated you are all of the time. And then it also works with the motor cortex or the somatomotor cortex to make precise movements. The somatomotor cortex is behind the frontal lobe, so think of like wearing a headband on your head. That's where the motor cortex is. We're going to talk about it a little bit more in just a few slides. But before we get to that, we need to talk about Phineas Gage. You've probably seen my Phineas Gage skull in my classroom, okay? That's who this is. That's this 3D printed skull. Phineas Gage is super important for our study of the frontal lobe because he had this railroad spike over here go through his eyeball and through his frontal lobe. He was a polite and respected foreman on the railroad. So he was working, and then there was an explosion, and he had this spike go through his head. Okay, it took out a teacup size portion of his frontal lobe. Teacup. So think about a little teacup and how much of that there is. The crazy thing is that he survived. He was still talking while this spike was through his head. He was still moving. He still had memory. So he had very little actual brain damage that didn't allow him, so he was functioning like a normal person. The thing that did change was that he had severe damage to that frontal lobe. So all of those things that we just talked about, that personality, the temperament, the judgment, the planning, all of those things were severely damaged in this accident. And so people said afterwards that he became much more aggressive and not really easy to get along with. Okay, so Phineas Gage is a super important case study to know in both the IB world and AP. Okay, the motor cortex, like I said, that is directly behind the frontal lobe. It's located like at the back of it, and it's largely responsible for our voluntary movements. So those movements that we decide to make. So that I decide to pick up my phone is a voluntary movement, and that is all controlled by my motor cortex. If you are awake during brain surgery, which is pretty often actually, and we poke at your motor cortex, different parts of it, the corresponding parts of the motor cortex will move. So you can see over here what parts of the body are controlled by which part of the motor cortex. Movements that are precise, so small movements or delicate, things like holding a pen with our hands, those are going to be controlled by larger portions of the motor cortex, whereas things that don't require such precise movement are going to be controlled by smaller sections. And we can see this through a homunculus. Homunculus are just people, right? So this is a person that is proportionally accurate to the space in the cortex. Okay, so it's what the body would look like if it were proportionate to the amount of space that's taken up in each cortex. You can see for the motor cortex, our hands are very, very large. That's because we need a lot of our motor cortex to be able to control those, okay? And our tongue and our mouth to be able to make speech sounds. Okay, the next one, the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is behind the somatosensory cortex, or the sensory cortex, and this is going to control things like body position, our spatial reasoning, so touch, pressure, temperature, etc. And it's also partially responsible or partially part of the somatosensory cortex, okay? So the somatosensory cortex is going to be our bodily senses. Soma, remember, means body, and then senses, so body, sensory cortex. So it's going to be those things like touch and pressure, temperature, pain. Again, if you stimulate parts of that sensory cortex, you're going to be able to stimulate. Someone would say that, oh, hey, you're touching my arm, or you're touching my hand, or you're touching my face. If we go back and look at the homunculus, you can see that the sensory model also has large portions for those parts of our body that are very sensitive to touch, pressure, temperature. Next, let's talk a little bit more about that sensory cortex. Like I said, it's located at the front of the parietal lobe. We perceive touch and pressure, but also temperature. If we stimulate parts of the sensory cortex, it would cause the person to feel pressure on that part of the body, even though we weren't touching it, okay? And then the more sensitive the area, the more surface area of the cortex dedicated to it. Use your imagination, which parts of the body are very sensitive to touch, to pressure, to temperature. And those are going to be the ones that have the most space. Okay, the next one is the temporal lobe. Your temples are right here. You put your hair behind your ears, that's where your temporal lobe is, okay? Right above the ear. This controls functions like our hearing. It also is a lot of our memory is within our temporal lobe, and then speech and language. We also have a lot of our processing of information and understanding in our temporal lobe. And then the occipital lobe is in the back of our head, okay, at the very back. This controls all aspects of our vision. Occipital, the root word is ossi, okay, so that is going to be eyes or vision. So this is going to be our vision. back here. Each piece of the visual cortex corresponds to a very specific part of the retina, okay? So our eyes send information, and where it is located, where that light goes into the retina, goes to a very specific piece of the occipital lobe, which then puts all the pieces together and processes what we are seeing, okay? Okay, so those are the lobes, the main areas of the brain. The next piece we're going to talk about are association areas. Association areas are uncommitted areas of the cortex, and these are involved in higher mental functioning. So higher area, higher order thinking, things like integrating information, interpreting information, acting on certain information that we get from the sensory or motor areas. So the information comes in to our sensory or motor areas, and then those association areas make sense of it, okay? There's two main association areas that you need to know. The first is Wernicke's area. It's actually German, so it should be Wernicke's, but we're going to say Wernicke's. It's in our left temporal lobe, okay? Our Wernicke's area is responsible for language comprehension and expression, okay? So this allows us to understand words, and it allows us to actually put together fluent sentences. So if we were reading and we had damage to Wernicke's area, we could understand what each word was. We could say those words, but we would not be able to understand what a passage meant together. And then the opposite side of that is Broca's area. Broca's area is in the left frontal lobe, and it's responsible for directing motor movement involved in speech. So it's actually forming words, okay? So Wernicke's area is understanding words. Broca's area is informing words. I am going to post another video under the links section that will explain these two areas really, really well and explain what happens when there's damage to one of these two areas. So I want you to watch that. It's not long. It's like 3 minutes long. But it really gives a good overview of what would happen if there was damage to one or of these areas. Okay, let's move on then to the hemispheres. Okay, our hemispheres, our brain is actually two separate brains that are connected, remember, by the corpus callosum. They're a mirror image of each other, and they function as two separate brains. And then they communicate by these fibers along the corpus callosum. So in our hemispheres, our right side of the body, so my right hand, I know it's opposite for you, but my right hand is controlled by my left hemisphere. It's opposite. And then it's vice versa. My left hand is controlled by my right hemisphere. Okay? And the only way that this can work or happen is through these connecting fibers. Okay? So the information is crossing over our brain in order to control the different sides of the brain. Our left hemisphere is going to be, let's look at the difference between the two hemispheres. And actually, I think we're going to stop here, and I'm going to just hop on to a second part of this video so I don't get cut off.